Good afternoon, everybody, and want to welcome you to this webinar, this presentation today. And for those of you that don't know, I'm Jeromy TenHag, and I work for Lactanet in the area of herd management, and notably with software and data. And work with advisors and producers on how it can be used to make more effective and more profitable decisions on farm. Also with us today is Dr. Ewen Ferguson, and I think many of the people on this webinar today will know Ewen. And as all of you know, Ewen's well known, well respected, very knowledgeable in the industry, and we're so fortunate to have Ewen to have Ewen with us today, but certainly also having Ewen working with our clients and customers across the country. We're going to be focusing on some findings on key production metrics from 2020 on, thousands of Lactanet herds and tens of thousands of test days. We're going to be presenting characteristics of high production dairies, and we're going to, again, base that on Lactanet records from herds across the country. We'll provide some information, and I think for some of you, hopefully, probably a lot of you, it'll be a review of DairyComp and how you can find some of these benchmark numbers for your clients so you can gauge how they're doing to their peers in the country and in your region, and certainly maybe even within your clinic. So the data that we're going to be presenting today is as a result of a data mining project, so to speak, that Ewen and I sort of worked on earlier this year. And we were able to take out all kinds of production data for the year 2020 out of the DHI processing center, and we combined that with some specific DairyComp related measures as well. And we were able to harvest, so to speak, test day measures on over 60,000 test days from over 6,800 herds tested within Canada. Okay, so there's test day measures that focus on specific test days per herd, and then there's also lactation measures, those lactation measures were also harvested, so to speak, in this project from 6,800 herds, and they're kind of more completed lactation record type information, and we'll get more into the specifics of that in a moment. We have Canadian numbers, we have some regional data breakdowns that we will share with you today. We did a similar but a lot smaller project for 2019, and I think we have presented some of that data last winter. The one thing I do want to also mention, and for sure it's an important piece to mention, is we couldn't have done this data mining and looking at this data without the help and the expertise from Dr. Dave Kelton and Karen Hands. We presented some of this information to Canadian producers. We had different sort of a similar type format, webinar for producers that would be focusing on data from the Ontario and provinces to the east, and then the next day we did a similar presentation for the focusing on data for the provinces Manitoba and West. Just as a quick summary, we only have so much time, so we could have gone for some time just looking at data 2020 compared to 2019. But we will say, the production data was similar. And this is a graph broken down by Parity for, 2,360 plus Ontario herds, comparing 2019, 2020 data. This is data at the 50th percentile, or kind of the, generally the average for herd level milk per cow per day, and then lactation 1, lactation 2, and lactation 3 plus. Very similar numbers. On numbers for Canadian herds, 6,800 plus Canadian herds, you'd have a very similar graph as we're looking at right here. I think it helps validate, well, first of all, it says, you know, production's been very similar year over year. It also validates the way we were pulling the data and how we were putting the data together. I think we would expect that the data would be similar. So we were happy with that. So more of the focus today is looking at 2020 data, and there's 8 different production parameters that we focused on, and you'll see that shortly. You know, we organized each production parameter into, you know, sort of benchmark numbers in quartiles, and then we also took the top decile or the top 10% for each of these production parameters. You know, we sorted this out by region, we sorted it by parity. And, you know, the question is, well, how would your client or customer herds compare to some of the numbers that we're going to show here? So, you know, a similar table that we put together last year, this is from, you know, 60,000 plus test days, over 6,800 herds across the country. We broke it into sort of a Canada section, a Lactanet West section, so that'd be Ontario in the West. There's Ontario herds and there's Western herds. And you're going to see, you know, the sort of the metrics that we talk about a lot: milk per cow per day, fat per cow per day, 305 milk per cow. And then certainly we see milk value on the right. And, you know, we've broken it into these quartile rankings and then the top 10% of herds for these different areas. And, you know, not only are there herd level numbers for each of these parameters, but we also broken it down by lactation group. And certainly there are differences, of course, as we expect, as we look at parity. So here's the other sort of measures that we also were able to dig into some, and, you know, 305 mature equivalent milk. And there's some interesting things that we can look at, and that'll be coming up in a few slides along the way here, but certainly peak milk, linear score. Those are things that came out of the data processing center. The week 4 milk that is in a block on the right here, that is information that was pulled out of DairyComp herd files. And we looked at, so we focus more so on Ontario and Western herds, just because that's more so where DairyComp files are predominant. And we have a file for every single herd that's tested there. And you can see, again, these similar measures broken by quartiles, top 10%, herd level numbers, and then benchmark numbers by parity as well. You know, and when we look at, you know, focusing or honing in on Canada versus Canada as a whole versus Ontario, highlighted here in these green boxes are, you know, 50th percentile or kind of middle of the road type numbers for these different production metrics, right? So how do, you know, herds that you work with, how would they compare to these numbers? You know, average milk per cow per day is in that 32 to 33 kilo per cow per day mark. You know, fat per cow per day is right around just under 1.3. You know, 305 milk right around that 10,500 mark, just above that. Milk value, you're in that almost $9,200 per cow per lactation. So, you know, and again, we can look at these other the remaining metrics here. You know, an interesting one that we'll talk a little bit more about as well is peak milk, and, you know, it was 41 kilos per cow for peak. Is that something you'd expect? Yes or no? You know, think about those things. You know, week 4 milk, I think a kind of a neat thing, and maybe I think a novel thing is, so we have some numbers to say what is a, you know, what is a normal or a average week 4 milk number? What's a really good number? I think we can answer some of those things as we go along today. So, you know, these different charts that I just shown here, these are already on the Lactanet website. So it's in the benchmarking section on the website. So certainly you can call up these reports at your leisure as you go to the Lactanet site. So, Ewen, I'll let you carry on from here.
Good. Thanks, Jeromy. Jeromy, as he said, we're tag teaming a little bit today. So my mouse is controlling his screen 250 kilometers away, so it's a pretty neat technology. Many of the graphs we're presenting today were developed in response to questions we had from producers and from advisors. And one of the questions we had was, how much difference in production should we expect between parities? And at the 50th percentile, so half the herds are above this, half the herds are below this, we're seeing about a 1,600 kilogram spread between lactation 1 animals and lactation 2 animals, and a further 650 kilogram spread between lactation 2 and lactation 3 plus. This is a different number than what we used to think about in the past. Today's heifers are different than previous year's heifers. We're certainly seeing that from this graph. Later, when we look at the top 25th percentile of herds, this difference is even more dramatic. So, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Having a good transition period and achieving a high peak translates into more kilograms of milk during the lactation. This relationship shows an average of 285 kilograms of 305 milk per kilogram of peak. Peak is important. When I was just a young veterinarian many moons ago, I think we were told this number was, maybe around 180, 200 kilograms per kilogram of peak. And I think the number got up to 220. And now we're seeing with this data set from 2020, 285 kilograms of milk per peak. So peak is very, very important. We also want to look at the impact of milking frequency on daily production. And the common rule of thumb that we hear from the industry is an increase of 15% when herds go from 2x to 3x milking. Looking at the 6,800 Canadian herds on this graph, the increase is about 17% going to 3x, and about 11% if we compare it with AMS, if we compare it to 2x herds. If we start to challenge herds now, and we've been talking about the 50th percentile up to now, but if we start to challenge herds and look at, well, what's the top 25th percentile of the herds doing, or the top 10 percentile of the herds are doing, we're seeing now that the overall daily milk production increases from the 50th percentile to the 75th percentile. The absolute milk numbers are higher, but the relationship stays roughly the same at about 9% and 15%. So we're still in that 10% roughly range for going to AMS, and 15 plus to go to 3x. So I think that's that relationship stays in place. If we look at only our Ontario herds, that relationship is about 12% and 19 for the 50th percentile. And if we go to the 75th percentile, again, you can see that the production numbers are higher. For example, the 2x herds are 32 up to 35, but the relationship stays roughly the same. We're not seeing that much of a difference between, depending on production levels. We're still seeing that range between AMS and 3x. We were very interested in kind of understanding what happens to parities, and on the we're told that heifers do better if they milk more frequently. So in this example of 60,000 test days in Canada, the herd example on the left uses the same milk weights as we used in a previous slide for the top 25th percentile of Canadian herds. Those numbers are the same. In the previous slide, we showed the milk increase of 9% for AMS herds and 15% for 3X herds. So if we want, and that's how the herd performed. If I want to zero in now and look at, well, how does the heifer herd compare to the herd? We're seeing about a 1% increase in production of the heifer herd compared to the whole herd. So it would seem that there is a benefit to milking heifers more frequently than not, but that difference seems to be around that 1%. I would have thought it was higher, but again, this is a lot of test dates, and that's kind of the number that we're seeing. If we look at Ontario, again, we got the the herd on the left, the 75th percentile on the herd on the left for Ontario. But now we're still seeing that increase of roughly 1%. The 17s that you see there, I think it's not exactly 17. I think we're about a 0.5% higher on the second group, the lactation 1 group. So there is a slight increase in production if we milk heifers more often. Jeromy, I think it's back to you.
Thanks, Ewan, and thanks for summarizing 305 milks and how milking frequency might impact production levels. So, so up till this point now, we've looked at the 8 different production parameters, but we looked at them independently. And we ranked them independently, totally on their own. They're not related to each other, but we're going to try and change this. And I think we've done a good job of changing this or making an attempt at, let's rank the herds by a certain metric. And in this way, we ranked all the herds, whether it's in Canada or by region, by 305 milk. So the highest 305 milk herds would be considered the best, and the lowest would be considered not so good. And we put them into quartiles, and we also looked at the top decile of 305 milk herds, and then what were the resulting traits or metrics for those ranked herds. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully I did a good job of explaining what we did or attempted. But so now that we've ranked all these 6,800 plus herds in Canada by 305 milk, here are some descriptive stats, so to speak, of these ranked herds. So the top 10% of herds ranked by 305 milk, these would be their numbers. You know, just over 39 kilos of milk per cow per day, almost 1.5 kilos of fat per day. You know, 305 milk, you can see the numbers here. The top 25% of herds ranked by 305 milk, and then you'll see their numbers, and obviously they're going to be a little bit lower. You know, the middle 50% of herds, and then the bottom 25% of herds, and how those values change when we look at ranked herds versus just each individual metric to itself. So so when we break the data out by this, and I think it's important to understand what the numbers are telling us. So, you know, if we look at the top 25% and it says, well, those top 25% of herds, they would average 37.3 kilos of milk per cow per day. But there's a range around that average. So that's the average of that top 25% of herds. Okay. And it'll be a lot more clear here in a couple of slides from now what, we have a neat box and a box plot to show the variation in the numbers for each of these quartile and top 10% rankings. So this is for Canadian herds now. Sorry for jumping around here a little bit. So this is for 6,800 Canadian herds on milk recording. So here's for 2,360 some herds in Ontario and what they're ranking, you know, being ranked by 305 milk, and then their metrics for each of these different groups. And you can see the numbers are very similar. You know, if we look at or focus in on for a second, the top 25% of herds, right? That 37.7. So it's it's not quite a half a kilo more. You know, that fat per cow per day is just over 1.4, and so on across the row here. So, and again, there is a range plus or minus those average numbers that you see for each of these quartile and top decile rankings, okay, and how those herds are ranked. But the Ontario herds compare very similarly to Canadian herds. But so here's what I'm talking about when you start looking at this distribution of the data. So, you know, on the previous two slides, we had, you know, 4 groups of herds, the top 10%, the top 25%, the top 50%, and then the bottom 25%. So there's 4 distinct groups of boxes within this graph. And if we look at the top quartile, you'll see the variation within that quartile. Okay, so if the average you know, for the 6,000 plus herds for that top quartile's 37.3 kilos of milk per cow per day. There is a range that's, you know, basically plus or minus 2 kilos. Okay. And then you can see the outliers. That's what the skinny little bars are outside the blocked bars. And so you can see the variation within a quartile, and you also see the variation across quartiles. Find it quite interesting. If you compare the top quartile to the bottom one, you know, there's a 12 kilo difference between top herds versus maybe the herds that are ranked, lesser ranked. You know, so they do all this, you know, similar type work on farm, but, you know, depending on what those strategies are on farm day to day, you know, they're making 12 kilos more on the top herds versus the bottom. You know, similarly for fat per cow, and with these quartile rankings, you'll see the variation. There's the average which within the quartile, but then there's also the range with around those averages. And again, if you, similar with milk production, you know, the top quartile versus the bottom quartile, there's a 0.4 kilo per cow difference between the top ranked herds versus the bottom ranked herds. So it's interesting, and it, you know, the management factors that go into what makes a top herd versus a bottom herd has a significant difference. You know, as Ewen commented on earlier, so here's a group for Canadian herds now, all 6,000 plus herds, the top 10% of them, the top 25% of them, and you know, focusing on 305 milk and milk value. And when you look at the differences between parity, you know, I think those differences, you know, at 305 milk level at least, probably not what we would expect or maybe are used to seeing, right? So, you know, up until, you know, not too long ago, I suppose, whether it was speaking with Bill Grexton, with Ewen, you know, you'd think that the 305 milk might be 1,000 kilos difference between each of these groups, but certainly those numbers are quite a bit different, as this would show. And if you recall back to one of Ewen's earlier slides where he was showing, you know, it was a 1,600 kilo difference and maybe a 600 or 700 kilo difference. These numbers are even more accentuated on the high ranking herds. Okay. And similarly with milk value, huge differences between parities. Certainly it goes lockstep with 305 milk production, of course. You know, in Ontario herds, again, very similar numbers as compared to Canada as a whole, and when we put this all together. So, you know, close to a 3,000 kilo spread between first lactation animals and mature animals. You know, quite similar between top 10% or top 25% herds. So, you know, if we look at 305 milk in maybe a little bit more detail, you know, there's a huge difference between, you know, first lactation group and third lactation group. You know, but can we use this information in other ways? You know, can we use it to maybe predict future performance? You know, at a recent, the Western Canadian Dairy Seminar, the virtual meetings there in March of this year, you know, Mike Van Amberg, a name that I think probably many of you or all of you have heard before. You've probably heard him speak many times over the years. You know, his comment was, you know, 305 milk for first lactation animals should be 80% of a mature cow, 305 milk. You know, so he will get this through, you know, data that he looks at, the American data. You know, how do Canadian herds compare to this, right? You know, is there an impact due to production performance? Is there an impact due to milking frequency? And I think we can comment on some of these things. So, you know, if we look at Ontario and the 2,300 and some 2,360 plus herds, you know, you know, we rank the herds like we have been up until now. You know, we've got our bottom quartile, our middle quartile, our upper quartile, and then our top 10%. That 80% lactation 1 to mature cow number, you know, not sort of, but it holds very closely in Ontario for Ontario herds as well. Maybe it's a little bit different for the bottom quartile of herds. That number seems to maybe be a little bit over 80%. You know, the other three production groups here, they're right pretty much bang on that 80%. So it's kind of interesting that, you know, the Canadian data would maybe follow along with some of these other folks and what they, you know, will present. You can see the different production levels along the bottom there for these groups of herds. You know, if we look at milking frequency and we look at specifically 2X herds, that, you know, lactation 1 to mature cow ratio of around that 80% mark still holds. There's not a lot of difference across production level for the 2X herds in Ontario. And, you know, we can go through, here's with robot herds now, and it looks like, at least as production gets, certainly the middle two groups of herds, you know, that ratio of lactation 1/305 milk to mature cow milk maybe goes up a little bit. And, you know, I suspect maybe, you know, lactation 1 cows, production is impacted maybe a little bit more favorably for them when they get milked more. Does that, you know, make their, you know, milk production or 305 milk values maybe a little bit closer to a mature cow level? Although the numbers are a slight difference. And if we, you know, look at 3X herds, that difference is maybe even a little bit more compared to robot herds. I will note the biggest difference really is in the bottom quartile herds, where that lactation 1 to mature cow ratio of 305 milk is even a little bit higher. So, but the data, you know, still would hold and is very similar to maybe what we've heard from others in the past for Ontario and for Canadian herds, actually. So, Ewen, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jeromy. I want to talk a little bit about 305 mature equivalent, and it's often misunderstood. It's very difficult to interpret because we don't really know what the right numbers are, and we're not really sure. We think there should be a relationship between parities, but that's been uncertain also. And I like this quote from Yogi Berra: "It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future." So if we're trying to compare all, I guess backing up a bit, the mature equivalent, it's trying to compare all animals within all parities on a level playing field. And DairyComp will produce various graphs, but it's difficult sometimes to know if your herd is doing well or not. Looking at Ontario herds in this case, and regardless of production level, if we use the third lactation group as our base or our standard, and we compare to that, it seems there's an association between the parities, and that association seems to be remarkably similar regardless of production levels. We should expect our first calf heifers to be superior to their dams because we're supposedly using improved genetics. So that's not unexpected. But what is a bit unexpected is the relationship and how close it is. So this association shows about a 4% increase in first calf heifers compared to their dams, and a 6% increase in second calvers compared to their dams. Maybe not surprising, the second calf group tends to be the chosen ones. I mean, they've survived the first lactation, and they're the ones you want to keep going forward. So, but we are seeing that relationship. So I can tell you from looking at a lot of different 305 ME graphs on DairyComp, that relationship is not the same for all herds. It's remarkably different from herd to herd. So I think it's nice to have some benchmarks that we could look at and compare herd to herd. Whoops. We saw a graph earlier showing the relationship of peak milk to 305. If we want to further investigate this relationship, and compare to production groups. And we also want to compare peak, is there a difference between parities? And we'd expect to see that. In this graph, if we look at the 50th percentile of herds in Ontario, lactation 1 animals peaked at about 35 kilos. Lactation 2 animals peaked at just shy of 45. And lactation 3 animals peaked at 48.2. So this is at the 50th percentile. So that's pretty decent peaks. And if I use the first calf heifers as a base in this case, the heifers peak at about 73% of their mature dams, or the third lactation plus cows. And the heifers would peak at about 78% of their older sisters, the second lactation group. And if I look at the top 25th percentile or the very top 10th percentile, that relationship is very similar. You can see that the absolute numbers have increased, which we'd expect with better herds, but the relationship between what a first calf heifer can do in relationship to her second calf sibling or her mature cow is quite consistent. So we're in that 72 range roughly from going to first to a mature cow, and about 77 or so to go between a first calf heifer and a second calf heifer. So I don't think we knew that before. I don't think we've ever really looked carefully at the difference in peaks from the different parities. In the bottom quartile, there's much less kilograms of peak, and there's certainly less difference between the parities. And that's not dissimilar to the relationship Jeromy just showed us with 305 milk. They just don't have that much of a spread. Linear score increases. I'm going to try and get this mouse here if I can. Nope, no mouse. Okay, not to worry. Linear score increases by parity, so we can see that. For example, let's look at the top 50 percentile. The orange is lactation 1, the gray is 2, and the yellow is lactation 3. So as the animals increase in parity, the linear score increases. So that's just saying that mature cows have a higher linear score than first calf heifers. That's not a big surprise. But what is interesting, I think, is as production increases, you can, if you just want to focus on the lactation 1 animals now, that orange bar is lower in the top 25th percentile of the herds, and it's even lower in the top 10th percentile of the herds. So linear score does increase by parity, but as production increases, linear score also decreases. So I think that's a good message. A lot of people think, well, these high producing cows, they've got more issues, they're probably more prone to getting udder health. But I think this message is saying that those high producing herds have good management and are doing a great job, and they're keeping mastitis issues under control. And certainly that seems to be the case here. What is a little bit alarming is how close lactation 3 cows are pinching that linear score of 3, which is kind of our point of where we don't want them to go past that. Certainly the bottom 25th percentile of the herds, so a quarter of the herds in Ontario have lactation 3 cows exceeding linear score 3. But even in the other 3 groups, we are pinching, we're certainly 2.7, 2.6, 2.7 linear score. So we are encroaching in that linear score of 3. So something to be aware of. And again, this is the average. So certainly within herd, there would be certainly lactation 3 cows that would exceed the linear score of 3. Weak interval milk is unique to DairyComp, and it's a value a lot of advisors have been looking at. Specifically, advisors have asked, is there a right number or a correct number in order to help benchmark? Week 4 milk is very early on the lactation curve, and so there's not a lot of data to say it's the accuracy of it. When you compare that to week 12 milk, we assume that's quite accurate because we've got lots of observations by that point, but now we're getting a little bit late in the game at week 12 if something is going wrong to make any management changes. I think it's also, so I think we can maybe use those numbers as absolutes to say, well, it should be this, it should be that. But I think it's equally important for each farm to know what their own numbers are, and then monitor if these values are, going up or going down compared to where their basically normal baseline is. So kind of use it within herd to see if changes are occurring and if we can make early observations. Ideally, week 4 milk should be a monitor of the transition program, as well as a way to look at future performance. If we look at this table, and for those of you who want absolute numbers, we've got week 4, week 8, week 12. We could choose any week we wanted. We just chose, basically on a per month basis. Sorry about that. My phone's ringing in the background. It'll go away in a minute. When we look at this, we can also rank these herds by percentile. And so we got Lactanet West, which is Ontario West. We've got Ontario on its own and the West on its own. Excuse me a minute. I'm going to shut that off. Sorry about that. You're never supposed to have a phone on when you're doing a presentation. So this table hopefully gives some guidelines and some rules or some targets, the benchmarks for those who for their herds. But just remember, it's probably just as important to look at the individual herds and see if you're going up or down compared to what you're used to seeing. So we've taken that table and we've taken the values from that table and we've prepared various graphs to see, what kind of trends we have. This graph shows lactation 1 heifers from Ontario based on production level. Again, the lowest 25th on the left and the top 10th percentile of the animals on the right. The graph shows comparisons between the intervals. So between the week 4 milk, between the week 8 milk and the week 12 milk. In this comparison, week 4 is between 91 and 92% of the week 8 milk. And regardless of production level, that trend is consistent. So it basically, just to repeat, week 4 seems to be about 91 to 92% of what we would expect by week 8. If we look at lactation 2, that range changes a little bit. It's up to 95 to 96% of week 4 milk compared to week 8. Again, production level has no impact. And if we look at lactation 3 plus animals, it's exactly the same as lactation 2. So we're seeing about a 4 to 5, 6% decrease of week 4 milk compared to week 8 milk when we look at these graphs like this. Now, if we look at a parity to parity comparison at this point, we want to compare the difference between parities, and we're looking at week 4 in this case. As we'd expect, the production at week 4 increases as the parity increases. So, lactation 2 animals produce more at week 4 than lactation 1 animals, and the same with lactation 3. When we looked at the 75th percentile in this case, or the top 25th% of the herds, we found that lactation 2 animals had about a 36% greater production at week 4 than first calf heifers and mature cows. Compared to lactation 1 animals, and mature cows had about a 44% higher production at week 4 than lactation 1 heifers. This trend was the same regardless of what region we looked at. We did the same with week 8, so that the numbers changed. They're getting closer. So in this case, we did the same comparison, but the second lactation animals were now at 31% higher at week 8, and mature cows were at 40% higher at week 8 than compared to lactation 1 animals. And by week 12, the trend is still decreasing a little bit. That they're getting closer. So the parity to parity comparison was 26% for second lactation calves and 34% for mature cows when compared to the first lactation heifers in the herd. I like this graph. When we graphed the 75th percentile of Ontario herds, it was easy to see that the red line, which is the first calf heifers, peak around 8 at week 8, and then plateaus, while the green and purple lines, which represent the second and third plus lactation animals, peak at week 8, and then drop back to pretty well close to the levels approximated by the levels that we saw at week 4. So this is a nice pretty graph, but it doesn't give me any numbers. So I like this graph. This is a bar graph. I got things popping up on my computer and on my phone. This bar graph puts the previous graph in perspective. We're looking at the herd and comparing to the production levels of week 12, which is the green bar. Week 4 milk is about 96% of the week 12 milk in this case. And week 8 milk is about 2% or 102% or 2% higher than the week 12 milk. This trend again is consistent regardless of the production level in the herd. I guess I just made that point. And Jeromy, I think you're on for the next section.
Yeah. Thanks, Ewan. And, I think that's great that how you went through and described the week interval milk. I know we take a lot of questions about that from customers as it relates to DairyComp. And it was, I think, something that's maybe a little unique that maybe we haven't talked much about in terms of providing comparison type numbers to talk about. So, so now we've given you a whole bunch, have spoken to and given you a bunch of numbers to compare to talk about, to think about. But well, where do I find numbers about my herds and the clients that I work with day to day or week to week? And certainly there are ways to find these numbers in different ways. We're going to obviously focus on DairyComp. That's what we know. And I'm going to guess that maybe some of these things are reminder pieces for a number of you. But, where do we, so if we want to look at milk per cow per day and find a number, right? This YRAVG1 command and the whole syntax is in the title of the slide here, this plot command. But all of you on this webinar will have YRAVG1 in your DairyComp. That's been a default command forever, and it remains a default in any new users. And so here's where you can start picking your numbers and start looking at, so by lactation group, milk per cow per day. You can also find this command in the lookout bar. You could type YRAVG1 on the command line. You can type out the full command if you like, right? So there's different ways to get to the end point. So there might be some terminology, DairyComp lingo that I'm talking about. So just so we're all on the same page, I think everyone's quite familiar with command line, right? But the lookout bar is the piece that I was maybe gonna mention, because maybe it's a term that we don't talk about a lot. I'm certainly old school and I'll use the command line all the time for everything. Not that that's the best way to do it either, but I'm just saying. But here's this lookout bar. So if you want to find like YRAVG1, you can click on the graphs tab that's circled in or squared in green to find that command instead of typing. So different ways to get to the same endpoint. And certainly remember, when you're in your DairyComp grid where it's displaying numbers, you can click on the graph tab to switch your display to view the data in graph form. If you're in a graph, you can click on the grid tab along the bottom of this slide to put it in number form in a lot of cases. So just be mindful of that in your DairyComp functionality and how you use it. This command here, I would say, is not a default one. So this is one that you'll probably have to, or not probably, many of you will have to type on the command line. You can use Alter to store it if this is a report that you really find useful. Certainly, I'm going to remind all of you to take advantage of the support team, the 1-800 number, and they'll be happy to help you if it's needed to have this command saved on a bunch of your client herd files. But their focus on the DairyComp team's focus is customer service, and we're more than happy to help help you if you need help with saving commands and creating new ones and so on. So, but again, looking at fat per cow per day by lactation group, herd as a whole, this herd here is making 1.7 kilos at the herd level, doing a tremendous job, I would say. Similar, these are all similar type reports. This one here, so milk per cow per day by lactation group is a default, as is the 305 milk by Parity or by lactation group. Okay, you're going to find this command in that graphs icon in the lookout bar that I showed you a few slides back. The command itself is called YRAVG2. You can type that on the command line if you find typing is easier. You can type out the full command if you want. That's in the title slide, the title of the slide here. And you can see these differences for your herds across Parity for 305 milk. Okay. I will say looking at 305 mature equivalent milk by Parity is not an example, a default type of command in your dairy comps. It works very similarly to all the other plot commands that we just went through, right? And so here we can start looking at, you know, how does 305 mature equivalent compare for my herds? You know, and right away, what jumps out at me at least is the first lactation group on this farm is, all things being equal, the lowest group in the herd, which is very atypical, I would say. A lot of times you'll see the blue and red lines close together, and the green line is the bottom line within this trend graph. This herd is not so much. And certainly I would say an opportunity for this herd to maybe do better. I wonder if it's related to heifer rearing and raising calves more so than anything else. But again, you have a good graph here to have a discussion with the customer. Certainly looking at these graphs, you know, we've talked about comparisons and benchmarks and, oh, this is what all the herds in Canada are doing or all the herds in Ontario are doing. You know, I think there's also huge value, and Ewen has alluded to this a few times as well, about doing benchmarking within herd. Okay. So, and that's what some of these graphs can help us with. You can see, hey, what was production levels 6 months ago? What is it like now? What was it like a year ago? So on and so forth. Ewen did a great job, a very detailed job of talking about how can we maybe look at week interval type milk metrics. DairyComp, you can easily create a report to show that information for you. This for sure won't be a default. This is something that you would have to type on the command line. Possibly use Alter to save this type of report if you find it helpful and you'd use it often. One of the things that I'll also raise with you, this wasn't a deal with producers because the M value column or MVAL column within this report is automatically, that item is automatically added for all DairyComp users as of October 2020. Okay. And those items were odd. There's a number of new items that were added for them, and it would automatically add when they downloaded their test day data after the test. For yourselves, the way you would load your client's test day data is a totally different process than from how a producer would do it. Therefore, these new items like MVAL do not get auto created for you. Easy enough to create them. It's tedious if you have many files to create them in. And again, please take advantage of the support team if you would like some of these types of new items related to test day data to look at for different herds within your business. So here we can look at average week 4, week 8, week 12 milk as well, peak milk across lactation groups, herd as a whole, you know, high production values for this herd. They're doing a tremendous job. So creating these week interval milk items, another trick to do this, and I don't know how widely known it is. I know some will know this already that are in this webinar. You can open the guide command, exit guide, and then you can use there's different week interval milk items that are sort of saved within DairyComp cal file temporarily, so you can make some of these reports. So a neat little trick if you want to look at some of those weekly milk items on the fly or at a quick look, and you maybe don't have them created already. That's an easy way of doing it. One, I think this is the final DairyComp related command piece to show you. But again, one of these plot commands where we can look at information, test day related information across lactation groups and herd is linear score. There's a command in your DairyComp. All of you will have it. It's a default for producers or advisors, YRAVG3. You can type that on the command line. You can use the graphs icon in the lookout bar to get there. Udder health in this herd, you know, at a very general sense is pretty good. The first thing that kind of sticks out to me is the first lactation group. Their linear score is maybe a little bit higher than where we would like it, especially if we go back 6 months or so. But anyway, that's just a secondary comment. So that was a DairyComp piece to kind of remind you, I think, probably a reminder more than anything for a lot of you, how do we find these numbers so we can compare, right? One final little subject that we'd like to touch on, and I'll kind of explain a little bit more why we're touching on it at the very end, but one of the other pieces, and you know, it's related to milk production, I think, not really related directly to all the different variables we've already spoken to today, but we also were able to pull out a lot of the KetoLab you know, milk BHB results for DHI herds for 2020 as well. And we put together a few graphs and we were able to compare what were we seeing for 2020 compared to the last graphs we had on this topic. I think they were from 2015 or 2016, I believe. So about 5 years ago. And, you know, there's lots of milk samples taken in that first 6 weeks after calving. You know, cows obviously have to be tested at, you know, within that period. You know, all these samples were collected between January 1st and December 31st, so strictly 2020 data. And we can see by region here and for the country as a whole, the percent of positive milk BHB samples, right? Positive being greater than 0.14 at the milk BHB level. So you can see that there, you know, the percent of positive samples is barely peaking above 20%, which is tremendous and a fair bit lower than if we called up the similar graph from 5 years ago, right? So lots of progress that has been made as it relates to, I would say, managing subclinical ketosis at the herd level on lots of our farms. That's, you know, Canadian herds. Here, if we look a little bit closer and look at Ontario herds, a little closer to home here for many of us, and we break this out by herd 305 milk ranking. So these are groups of herds ranked by 305 milk. They're ranked in deciles. So the bottom 10% is on the left, the top 10% of herds are on the right. And you can see as production level goes up, the percent positive rate of samples for the first 21 days in lactation goes down. Probably not unexpected. That's why, at least one reason why, those herds are probably higher producing herds. But certainly, they're, you know, the one thing that does, that does jump out is there's still a significant number of samples that are still over, you know, that are testing positive. And we're kind of over that 20% threshold that we talk about lots with customers. Similarly, if we look at the percent positive samples by region and also by parity in that first 21 days, so as long as cows were tested in that first 3 weeks after calving, we can see, and I don't think it's surprising, we can look at the region level, you know, all cows, which is the blue bar, that will match the graph from 2 slides ago. But then you can see the lactation 1, lactation 2, and lactation 3 plus, and the percent of positive samples for each of those parities. And probably not surprising, the older cows, you know, I think it kind of reiterates there still is some work to do. And, you know, and they're exceeding that 20% threshold that we sort of deem as maybe being the threshold to indicate maybe more of an issue. But those older cows are certainly ones that are surpassing that threshold. So, you know, this KetoLab information that we just shown is just part of a whole other slew of information that we have that we'd like to sort of dig into. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the very end, but I think Ewan's going to wrap things up here in the next little bit. So I'll leave it with you, Ewan.
Jeromy, can you advance the slide for me, please? Someone must have cut that cord to go out, the mouse cord. So I'm going to summarize what the presentation has shown us. I think I've got about 15 different points, and we're just past the hour, so I'll go through them fairly quickly because I see some questions coming up. So what have we learned? I think one of the things we learned was that we have Canadian data, and the interesting thing is, you know, we've always relied on other people's data, a lot of it American, and nothing wrong with that, but it's kind of nice to get our, you know, our data. If I tell people that if you milk cows and you're on DHI, your numbers are part of this data set. So I think that's quite powerful. So the first thing that we've learned is that, you know, production decreased marginally. Jeromy just showed the one graph of kilograms of milk, but we saw similar trends with fat kilograms. But, you know, the point was, is, you know, we were able, between the 2 years, we've got 130,000 test days of data. So I think we have quite a bit of power in the numbers that we've presented. Point number 2, production does matter. Half the herds in in Canada produce 32.1 liters, and half produce more than that, and half produce less than that. And similarly, 1.28 kilograms of butterfat per cow per day. You know, I don't think we've ever been able to look at a farmer in the eye before and say, you know, you're below average or you're above average. We get a sense, but we've got some pretty solid numbers to go by that. The top 25th percentile of the Canadian herds produce almost 3 liters more than that, and 1.42 kilograms of butterfat. So there is a spread between the middle and the as we get into the top better herds. Oops. Early starts are important, and we showed from the peak versus 305 graph that for every kilogram of peak, we were seeing about 285 kilograms of 305 milk throughout the lactation. The heifers from the top herds, they're peaking about 72% compared to their lactation 3 dams, and about 77% compared to the that's a typo, Jeromy. Compared to
I see that.
Compared to the lactation 2, their siblings. The milking frequency increases daily production. I don't think we are surprised by that. If we use the 2X herds as a base, the AMS herds generally are producing 8 to 12% more than 2X herds, and the 3X herds are producing 15 to 19% more than the 2X herds. And again, the industry often quotes about 15%, so we may be doing a little bit better than what the industry has said. Heifers that are milked more frequently produce more milk. Again, I think we've known that. And whether we looked at the daily milk production or we looked at the trend on 305 milk, that advantage seems to be around that 1%. And again, I thought it would have been higher than that, but that's what we're seeing when we look at it 2 different ways. When we look at the 305 milk production for the top 25th percentile of the herds, we used to think that the spread between parities was about 1,000. So 1,000 between lactation 1 and 2, and another 1,000 between 2 and 3. So that adds up to 2,000. Well, now we're seeing, you know, we saw from the charts that we're almost at 3,000. We're getting almost an extra 1,000 kilograms of milk between lactation 1 and mature cow status. So the industry has changed, and that's a lot more, certainly a lot more milk than we're used to seeing. We seem to be following Van Amberg's recommendation that our heifers seem to be at about 80% of the 305 milk of their mature dams, so that we're right on target there. And again, we're seeing that extra 1 to 2% more milk if heifers are milked more frequently. We saw, as I said, that was shown in the daily production also. the 305 mature equivalent, I think I find this very exciting because, I don't think we've ever had really numbers to look at or to say this is where maybe we should be, but the heifer mature equivalent seems to be about 3 to 4% higher than their lactation 3+ dams. And the second lactation mature equivalent is about 6% higher when compared to the lactation 3+ dams. So I think we can use this when Jeromy showed the graphs of the MEs for heifers compared to the second and third. I think we kind of use this information now to say, yeah, we could be doing a bit better, or you're doing a great job. So it gives us some guidelines. And that trend was consistent regardless of production level. Jeromy, oh, there we go. The key differences for the top 10 percentile of the herds is that the top herds produced almost 50 kilograms a peak, which is 7.2 kilograms more than the average, or the 50th percentile. And the herds produced 2,000 kilograms more milk in the 305 lactation versus the 50th percentile. So the top herds have a lot more room to make, are making a lot more milk, and I would argue possibly more money. The top 10 percentile herds have higher milk revenue, almost over $1,500 more milk revenue than the median 50th percentile. The top 10% of the herds also have better udder health. And so we're seeing that in spite of better production. But as we showed earlier, the caution that lactation 3 animals still seem to be at risk in many herds. So something there's more work to be done there. We didn't talk about MUN, but that was one of the parameters we looked at under the characteristics graph or the table. And the MUN values seem to be the same on high producing herds, or in some cases lower than the 50th percentile. And the MUN values seem to be averaging around the high 11s. And that seemed to be pretty consistent. The top 25th percentile of the herds produced 12 kilograms more than the bottom quartile herds. That was the box plot that Jeromy showed. And again, the same group, almost half a kilogram more butterfat than the bottom quartile. So there's a big spread between those herds doing well and those herds that could see some improvement. Linear score, it increased with parity. As production increases, linear score decreases. Many lactation 3 cows still have linear scores approaching 3. The subclinical ketosis testing, Jeromy talked about this, almost 250,000 samples. It has been widely adopted as a herd level monitor, and I'll stress that it's a herd level monitor. It's never been intended to be a cow level monitor. We have seen large improvement in subclinical ketosis over the last 5 years, but 50% of the herds in Ontario still have greater than 20% of fresh cows showing positive. And that number's not ironically, but the Western Canada herds seem to be maybe doing a bit better job. They've got 30% of the herds in Western Canada have cows exceeding the 20% of fresh cows. Linear lactation 3+ cows, fresh cows in all regions often exceed 25% positive as fresh cows. So we still have some work to be done. And the last point, the week interval milk, the interval to interval comparison show consistency in milk increases between week 4 and week 8. And that consistency is about, week 4 milk's about 92 to 95% of week 8 milk. That's a bit parity dependent, but it's in that range. If we look at parity to parity comparisons, we see consistency in milk increases between parities, and it depends on which interval we're measuring, but that range between lactation 2 and lactation 3 milk is about 30 to 40% higher than lactation 1 animals production. And if we use week 12 milk as a standard, week 4 milk is about 96% of week 12 milk. Week 8 milk is about 102% or 2% higher than week 12 milk. And that trend is consistent regardless of production levels. And Jeromy, I think the last slide is yours.
So I know we've went over time a little bit here, but certainly we hope that that everyone that's been part of the webinar today is taking some nuggets away that you can use with your clients. The one thing that we want to make sure you're also aware of is we have a whole host of other data and metrics that we're working on, sort of summarizing and putting into a package that we can deliver to producers and advisors like yourselves. And so we've got plans to do, more of these types of sessions to describe, for you, what does a top repro herd look like? How can we describe transition with some different type measures, including week 4 and the KetoLab. That's kind of part of that.
All right, thanks, Jeromy. Yeah, we've got a couple of good questions here. I'm going to start you off with some easy ones. Chris Church asked, is this data just for Holsteins?
Currently, we don't have anything broken out by breed.
Okay. The second easy question, will these slides be available after the presentation? And if so, where can advisors find them?
So what we did with the producer group, and I think this worked well, I'm going to suggest to anybody that wants a copy of the slides, we're more than happy. We'll email them to you. Just jot this email address down. It's DC, so David Charlie at lactanet.ca. Just send a note to that's the support, the DairyComp support email group email address, and someone will respond to you in short order with the slides from today. Absolutely.
Asked if you could comment on why there's a 5 to 8% milk increase with 3 times herds over robot herds.
We saw that same trend last year when we did the 2019 data, and we've certainly presented this to many different groups, certainly last year before COVID, and that didn't seem to be a surprise to producers. We kind of thought we'd have the red and blue trucks circling our hotel room some nights, with that kind of information. But I think what the trend is showing is that 3X herds, every cow gets milked 3 times a day, regardless. And I'm not sure if that's always the case. And that certainly the robot producers in the meeting often said, yeah, we got lots of cows getting milked more than 3 times, but we have cows that are not getting milked 3 times a day too. So especially the tail end cows. So that was their explanation, Phil. I don't know if that's the whole answer or not, but that's certainly the trend, and we certainly have lots of numbers to back those. And as I said, the trend was exactly the same in 2019. So it's not an aberration that we're seeing this year. But that's again, we're just kind of reporting what we see, and that's what we saw.
Yeah, he had originally asked the question, do we know how many robot herds achieve 3 times milking, and do we know the range of milkings per day for those herds, and how does that affect the difference between the milk per day between robot and 3 times? So I'm sure that.
Yeah, I don't think we know that number. Sometimes that's held very closely by each company's data set, but certainly I think the herds that achieve closer to 3X certainly would, 3 times robot herds that can be milked 3 times a day consistently, I'm sure would be very close to the herds that are milked 3X in the conventional manner. So,
okay.
Just one final point to that is with the robot report that Lactanet offers customers, it does collect some of this, visits to the robot per cow and some of these different types of measures. That just wasn't part of the data set that we had available to us. So, I think potentially in the future, that is something that could be investigated fairly easily, I believe. But so that info is there somewhere, just as part of the data set we have.
Right. Had Reg Clinton asked, should we look at total kilos or a percentage of 305 milk?
I don't think I understand that question.
Yeah,
total kilos of milk. Oh, I see. Okay. I think he's wondering the total kilos that a cow produces throughout her lactation versus what happens by 305? I think that, Reg, if that's not the answer to the question, then come back to me. But so the 305 milk.
Sorry, he just responded. He said in relation to parity. Oh, he said he kind of answered it already.
Okay, well, I'll try to answer what I think he was asking, but people sometimes get mad at the 305 milk because they think it, the cow gets to 305 and, we just stop everything and the cow doesn't count. If she wants to milk for 400 days and that's really a farm decision, I mean, that milk is counted as her total kilograms of milk produced during that lactation. But the 305 is really just a measure, a cow-to-cow measure to say who gets to the 305 post first. And usually the cow who gets to that 305 finish line first with the highest amount of milk is the winner. Now, if she wants to go on and milk for another 100 days or 500 days, that's the farmer's business and the cow's business. And that contributes to the bulk tank and, the cow's productivity. But so 305 milk is just a measuring stick. It doesn't mean we have to dry cows off at 305 days or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Got another question from Phil, but I'm going to bump it down and we'll get to it just after this one here. Can you comment on week 4 milk for herds on 10 times a year DHI testing? Does it sample animals that happen to be in week 4, or is it only relevant for herds with daily milk in DairyComp?
I'll take this one. I was expecting a question around this. So week 4 milk is a value that that will be generated whether the herd is on DHI and has no meters, daily milk metering, or if they're not on DHI and they have DairyComp linked to a parlor or milking system. In any of those scenarios, DairyComp will provide a week 4 or week 8, some kind of week interval milk value. And I think in the past, and I don't think this is what was meant by this question, but I know I've had questions in the past. Well, if a cow is tested at 30 days in milk, she'll get a week 4 measure. Well, what happens in 2 tests from now? Is that week 4 milk value now going to be different because there's more test day data points? And I've gone through this on probably 5 to 10 herds over time. And once a cow gets a week 4 milk number, it doesn't seem to really change throughout the lactation. So as more tests are added, that week 4 value seems to stay the same. That's what I see. So, in that number, like if the cow was tested on day 30 or day 38 or day 7 for the first time, once she's past 28 days, she's going to get a value based on how her curve is plotted out. So there will be a value. So
if I could add to that, DairyComp has built this internal lactation curve that plots cows. It just basically, as Jeromy has said, certainly herds that are on daily milk recording through their parlor, I would put more emphasis on that curve than on one where, the test intervals say it's 40 days or 50 days. But regardless of that, we still, that prediction seems to be pretty valid. And going through the exercise I did where I think we can assume week 12 milk is really accurate because we have lots of observations. That consistency between week 4 and week 8 to week 12 milk is phenomenal. Like it just seems to be very, very consistent regardless of production level. So I think it's it's kind of an abstract number, but I think it's a good number. And the advantage of it, of course, is that it's an early number. It's 30 days, 40 days before peak. So the earlier I can get a number, maybe help the herd or the management, I think the better off we are.
Okay. So when comparing 305 ME first projection and week 4 milk within herds, will the same decision be made on transition cow health? For example, does a herd advisor reach the same conclusion regardless of which metric is measured?
That's a really good question. I asked Steve Eicher about this one time during one of the certificate programs, and I think in his opinion they're both basically the same. Probably get to the same place. It's just a little different measure, but I think the ranking would be pretty close. And it was basically Steve Eicher that's basically built the week interval milk as well as probably the projection. So I personally use the week interval milk because the reason I like interval milk is that every cow is compared at the exact same point in her career. So if I look at peak milk, for example, peak might occur at day 40, day 50, day 60. We don't know. But if I look at week 4 milk, it happens with every cow at week 4, or week 8 milk, every cow at week 8. I think the first projection ME, I think suffers the same issue. Jeromy, you can correct me on that, but I think it doesn't necessarily occur at week 4 or week 8. It can vary with each
that's
cow.
right. Exactly.
So you are comparing a little bit differently, but I think if you really were keen on the 305 ME first projection, and that's what you used to be using, I'm okay with that.
The only thing I will add to that is, especially when you're using the DairyComp items that we've chatted about, like there's a 305, I guess first test projection would be FST PJ. Week 4 is, whatever the item name is. Week 4 milk is normally not mature equivalent. So you can't compare all the lactation groups to each other. You can certainly compare within lactation group, right? Whereas a 305 mature equivalent, you can kind of compare everyone together. So just be mindful of that. But I think the same herd trends would appear regardless of what value you use.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We had great attendance and great questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the engagement at the end here. That's awesome. And stay tuned in the future for more of these types of sessions. So